Welcome, patrons. Even before the game launched, Veilguard was said to carry the theme of regret, and sure enough, one of the major plot points that happens is that Solas castles his Rook to switch places in his prison locked with regrets. However, unlike the immortal gods before them, Rook is able to escape by confronting and getting over theirs. As someone with a master's in therapy, you can understand why this idea caught me on fire, and I want to take you all along on my journey of understanding what getting over regret even means, along with likely answers as to why a god could not escape, but the mortal Rook could. The Cage for Gods. The Cage for Gods, or the Regret Prison, as the fandom has been calling it, has been a hot subject for various reasons, mainly being that there are a lot of questions left unanswered in the wake of the mission. But while the game doesn't directly answer a lot, as is usually the case with fate-based missions, I do think there is something to talk about. Why does it exist? So as stated in the game, Solas built the prison to hold Ghil and Elgranon in place after he took the veil down. It was then locked with regrets, something Solas notes in a codex that they will be slow to open. The question I have is this: why? Making a cage for gods makes sense, but why not just kill them? Why have a cage with a door to begin with? Why not lock them away and throw away the key? In one part, to kill them, Solas would have to kill their archdemons. That itself is quite an ordeal for him, as seen in the last mission of the game, so yeah, trapping them is just going to be easier. But, and we can't actually be sure, but my theory is this. In Inquisition, when you are doing judgments, Solas largely gives more approval for using your prisoner to the best of their worth rather than locking them away or killing them. Morgan, who was raised by Mythal, similar to Solas as one might suggest, has this whole speech about preserving knowledge even if dangerous. Solas calls the Evanuris his mortal enemies, but now that he has them within his grasp, he doesn't want to waste their potential by killing them. Now, obviously when plans go wrong and they are running amok, he's coaching Rook on how to kill them, but I think that's also because their deaths now further his goal of taking down the Veil. Had he the ability to use them, he would. I would argue he even tries during the Blood of Arlathan mission when he was chatting with Elgranon.
This world is ruined already. Your Veil destroyed it. You could heal it. You have the strength to repair the damage without using the Blight.
But I mentioned that Solas doesn't like letting his prisoners rot without purpose. Gods trapped in a regret prison only really serve them at best. What would they have been used for? Well, as a theory, and going back to the many murals we have, I think there are a few parts to the Veil. There are the Evanuris prisons that help construct the Veil itself, the fate that is held back by the Veil, and then at the center of it all, the Black City which contains the Titan's dreams, aka the Blight. Solas was clear that he did not want the Blight to get out, so what if he was to use the Regret Prison to hold the remaining gods, who would then have helped create the barrier for what holds the Blight back? Patching together the mural pieces we have to illustrate my idea here, it would look something like this. I do also think there are questions about how the ritual was going and the state of the prison because it was stopped midway. We don't know how finished the prison is, and I would also assume that Ghil and Elgranon would have needed to be held in separate cells. While it's not confirmed, it's absolutely possible that there is an empty regret prison just floating around, waiting for a victim. Alternatively, because no one was actually held in this hypothetical second prison for the entire game, the magic could have started without a host and it collapsed. Or it just never existed, I don't know. The trapped Evanuris' use could also link together with the redeem ending for Solas, where he talks about trying to calm the Blight to the best of his abilities. While the game doesn't quite make it clear where Solas goes off to at the end of the game, posts on Blue Sky from Trick Weeks, lead writer for Veilguard, says that he went back to the Regret Prison. His position in the prison could give him the ability to calm the Blight, and perhaps adding another theory onto this, what if Solas had intended the Evanuris to repent their sins of the Blight by calming it themselves before they could have been freed? At worst, they don't do it and the Blight stays locked up, and at best they fix the Blight and realize they were wrong. Frankly, it's a win-win. Now, again, I have no proof for this. This is all wild speculation on my part, based on the fact that Solas has historically been one to use all the tools at his disposal. How does it work? Going into something a bit more concrete, what is meant by something being locked by regret? I think functionally in the prison, the rift to leave does not appear until you have wrestled with your regrets. This is also noted in the codex entry we found in the Wolf's Den. Rifts in this veil are spawned by death and bloodshed, or their memory. Even mortal regrets have such power. The rift is only caused by dwelling on the memory of what one regrets, and perhaps only open by regrets that involve death and bloodshed. However, in an interesting twist, the prison is also trying to help you create that rift. The prison has a sort of logic to it. It's reactive to who is inside, and can even talk and mimic memories. There are a ton of questions on how and what limits it has. What is the extent of the intelligence of the prison? Could you have an in-depth conversation with it? Was Varric part of that prison, or was he left over from Solas' blood magic lingering on Rook? Now, one theory we can put forth is that there is an intelligent spirit that is responsible for the logic of the prison. In an early version of the prison that was found in the files, there was a demon of regret that was to taunt the player. While the game does not call out that there is a demon of regret at the core of the prison, there is no reason to say otherwise. And given that things in the Fade are shaped by spirits and memories, it's even expected that there are ambient spirits there that quietly pick away at your memories, showing you your deepest regrets. There is also another element here, and why Solas needed to use Rook in the first place. The regret prison seems to attach itself to a person and drag them in, weighing them down until they are able to let go. Weeks also implies this when asked about the fate of the dagger on Blue Sky, which we will get to the dagger one day. This video is long enough without talking about the endings in depth. Solas will need to do the mental work to escape the trap in full, and even with the help of the dagger, would be unable to escape. We're not really given the specifics on how this works, but let me give you a theory. I think that whatever magic or spirit makes it the prison is looking for pools of regret to feast on, and once it finds it, it drags it in to feed. This is already a well-established idea within the lore and various demons, so it's really not out of the realm of possibilities. So then, let's quickly examine the times that people are taken in. At the start of the game, Solas is taken right after killing Varric and seeing the face of his enemies freed. Not hard to imagine that he's feeling immense regret here, even if it was just for Varric. Later on, when Rook is the one getting sucked in, Solas is using blood magic to make this situation worse, showing a dead Lucanus and even very briefly showing Varric stabbed. That, along with the events of Tearstone Island and his bitchy little monologue, is enough for Rook's feelings of regret to outweigh Solas's in that moment, allowing him to free himself. In this version, the magical chains are seen as rock statues that Rook is trying to hold on to, a much more visual representation of what's going on, in my opinion. And then at the end of the game, during the sacrifice, violent, and trick endings, Solas is bound to the Veil and instantly regrets what is happening. That his plan for, again bringing up the Wolf's Den Codex, reparation, has officially failed. This summons the chains of the hungry prison to drag him back. This is also why those same chains don't appear in either Redeem endings when he binds himself to the Veil. It's not the binding of the Veil dragging him back, it's his overwhelming regret. And in the Redeem endings, he does not regret binding himself and is able to step in willingly to seek his atonement. But wait, some of you just cried out. Specifically in the table discussion for the trick ending, Morgan says that the magic backlash of using the wrong daggers would hold Solas in place, not his regrets. To which my response is, the trick ending is also the one where Solas is trapped before he is cut, so the magical backlash triggers the fate change and his regrets drag him in. The truth is, this is a very loose part of the theory. I get if some people don't gel with that explanation here, but this is just how I see it. So then the next question I found myself asking was this: what is regrets, and how, as the game keeps putting it, do you let go and work through regret? Unfortunately, for all of you, I have a master's in therapy and too much time on my hands, so take a seat, and yes, this will be long and extremely necessary for the remainder of the video. Disclaimer. I'll be quick, but I need to be self-aware and let you know where I'm coming from in my analysis here. I've mentioned time and again on this channel that I have a master's in therapy. However, I do not currently have a therapy license. I let it lapse about 4 years ago after my daughter was born to stay home with her, plus the cost of keeping up a license while not practicing, and COVID was like a little too much for me at the time. As such, to say I'm rusty is an understatement, but even if I were practicing, there is another note. My master's is in marriage and family therapy. Individual and family therapy are completely different beasts, and while I was trained in, had a license for, and practiced individual therapy, my passions did lay elsewhere. Also, in my practice, I worked in a largely poor and overworked area in rural America, and mostly with children, so I preferred theories and types of therapeutic practices that relied on more concrete, actionable steps rather than ones that recommend a lot of self-introspection. So, in short, kids don't tend to have a lot of lingering regrets, so this isn't something I dealt with on a day-to-day basis. So, a lot of the theory and practices I present here are mostly outside of what was my normal wheelhouse, but I'm at least still able to read academic papers well enough, so here we are. And on another note, nothing in this video should be taken as serious therapeutic advice. This is all for fun. If you're actually having some problems and want to seek help, I'm very sorry, but this is not the place to find it. Defining regret. So as cringe as it is to start off a lecture with defining words, I think regret is vague enough to warrant it, because outside of the linguistic definition in a dictionary, psychologists can't seem to completely agree on a detailed definition of what regret functionally is when talking about the general human emotion and how it relates to other feelings like guilt, shame, and remorse. I also want to take a moment to note that a lot of the literature I found on regret also lump into 3 fields of study. The one I'm focusing on, cognitive psychology, business psychology, which leans into things like buyer's remorse, and medical treatments, which tended to compare medical treatments and recipients that regretted certain procedures, mostly with cancers, from what I could find. Because there was just more money in those latter two, those 2 pools ended up being a majority of what is available for free online, but things I'm also actively ignoring for this video. Anyway, a lot of the different research I came across tended to point to one particular article as a starting point for research in regret, the 1987 paper by Janet Landman titled Regret, a Theoretical and Conceptual Analysis. While regret is similar to feelings of undoing, remorse, and guilt, it holds a space of its own. Regret is a more or less painful cognitive/affective state of feeling sorry for losses, transgressions, shortcomings, or mistakes. The regretted matters may have been sins of commission as well as sins of omission. They may range from the entirely voluntary to the accidental. They may have been actually executed deeds or entirely mental ones. They may have been committed by oneself or by another person or group. They may be moral or legal transgressions or morally and legally neutral. And the regretted matters may have occurred in the past, the present, or the future. Pretty much every researcher agrees wholeheartedly with this admittedly very large definition of regret, but what I think is most noteworthy is her insistence that regret is not just based on emotion, but reason as well. The exercise of uninhibited emotion quite obviously makes for faulty decisions and actions, but the exercise of unrelieved rationality makes for equally faulty decisions and acts. Ideally, reason and sentiment are equally honorable compeers in the attempts to live well. Landman goes on to say that there is a ton of room for research on what regret is functionally for, and so laid down the question that many people have tried to answer. So I want to present 3 different theories about the functionality and psychological cause of regret that I came across that I like for various reasons, but I also want to stress that there are many more. First is an answer that comes up fairly high on a simple Google search from Psychology Today written by George S. Everly. It frustratingly does not explain what thought process goes into this definition, however I think it is important to include the easy-to-find answer in our list. Everly states that regret is tied to guilt and shame and makes up a pattern of behavior that revolves around action. Guilt is the feeling of responsibility for an actual or perceived offense or wrongdoing. Regret is the acceptance of responsibility of that guilt and also leads to thoughts of repentance and atonement, a longing to make something right. And shame is humiliation and distress when one's regrets cannot be fixed. The 3 are all linked. Guilt is catalyst, regret is the feeling that spurs us into action, and shame is the bad end when the action fails. In this viewpoint, regret's function is self-discipline. It pushes us forward, fixing our wrongs, and we are punished with shame if we fail. Second is a look at regret from a cognitive behavioral standpoint by Robert Leahy in his 2022 book, If Only. He explains regret as the emotion of possibility. Regret is the cost of wisdom. We can imagine a world better than the one we have lived in. We can imagine what life would have been like if we chose something else. Regret is the ability to imagine possibilities. It is the aspirational possibility emotion. It points to what could have been or what might be, not limited by what really exists. In Leahy's explanation, he agrees with Everly's basic function of regret but divorces it from guilt and shame, saying that while the ideas are related, they are separate from one another. Regret alone helps us self-criticize and self-correct when outcomes are negative. Never feeling regret is not a sign of wisdom or righteousness. It may be a sign that you don't learn from your mistakes. You can make room for regret rather than needing to eliminate it. You can have a regret about something without spending a lot of time with the regret. You don't have to be tyrannized by it to the point of never making a decision again. You don't have to let it hound you or bury you in guilt and rumination. And you don't have to eliminate regret from your life to weaken its power over you. He goes on to elaborate on an idea that he calls productive regret. Basically, a regret that stems from something that can involve an action, something that can be worked on or towards. Unproductive regret, then, is continued focus on something that one cannot correct, cannot undo, and cannot reverse. In his view, regret is a part of our evolution as humans. Its function is that it helps us plan for possibilities, learn from past mistakes, and reduce impulsive behavior. Problems arise when a person spends too much time thinking about past mistakes rather than acting to fix or atone for them. third is a research paper by Shai Davidai and Thomas Gilovich, published in 2018, titled The Ideal Road Not Taken: The Self-Discrepancies Involved in People's Most Enduring Regrets, which takes an approach to regret from the self-discrepancy theory. Which, this is a bit more obscure than cognitive behavioral theory and also requires you to know a bit of the theory to talk about, so a very quick summary. Each person has 3 views of themselves, and I will help illustrate my point here with Solas because it's been a minute since we actually talked about Dragon Age in this Dragon Age video. The ideal self, which is their internal representation of attributes that they or others would like them to possess, like goals, aspirations, or wishes. The ought self, which is the internal representation of attributes they or others believe should possess, like duties, obligations, or responsibilities. And the actual self, the internal representation of attributes a person believes they possess. In this particular theory of behavior, different problems arise when the discrepancies between the selves are too great. Which I do want to quickly say that for those of you that do have like a touch of psych knowledge, might be asking like, how is this different from Freud's psychodynamic theory? And this video is not the time or place for that. So you're just going to have to trust me that it is. At face value, there's a lot of similarities, but it's different. Anyway, in the paper, they dive into the idea of regret within this theory. We argue that failures to live up to one's ideal self inspire less extensive coping efforts than failures to live up to one's ought self. Thus, one reason that failures to live up to the ideal self tend to remain salient in people's minds is that they do not elicit as much psychological and behavioral repair work as failures to live up to the ought self. The immediate guilt, anxiety, and agitation that comes from failure to live up to one's duties and responsibilities are hot emotions that beg for quick resolution. In contrast, the slowly accumulating disappointment, discouraging, and dejection that comes from failure to live up to one's goals and aspirations are less likely to elicit the same immediate reactions. And after a number of studies, which I'll link the paper below if you would like the numbers on this, they find exactly that. We found that people of different ages and diverse demographics regret their failures to live up to their ideal selves more than their failures to live up to their ought selves. Why do actual ideal discrepancies spark such enduring regrets? As we found, failures to act on one's ideals do not elicit the same behavioral and psychological coping efforts as failures to act on one's oughts or shoulds. So, and I am reading a bit between the lines here, so forgive me, but in this framework, regret functions as a sort of measure to help balance the actual self with the ideal and the ought. Along with that, they make the distinction between quick and enduring regrets. Enduring regret is the feeling of not meeting the standards you and others set for you, urging you to catch up to them. Overall, in the 3 definitions of regret that I laid out, there is a clear theme that they agree on. Regret is trying to be a solution, but when incorrectly thought about or acted upon, can lead to problems. So then, what does it really mean to move past regrets? I think to really explore the idea, we're going to have to talk about what one would do in the real world in a therapeutic setting. Therapeutic practices. So to begin this section, we need to have a small talk on what is therapy, because there are a lot of misconceptions, even from people who have been to therapy. Now, behind the curtain, the short version of therapy is that there is a huge pool of researchers who have made and, to the best of their abilities, tested out different theories on how the mind works. Based on these theories, tools and practices are then built to help people heal and live with various problems. Many of you have heard about cognitive behavioral or psychodynamic theories, but what about Gestalt, existential, drama? The list of theories are endless and range from highly respected to downright nonsensical, and this only includes individual therapy. When you do groups or families like I did, there's a whole other set of theories to work from. So all is to say is that there is not just one accepted route to getting over regret. There are 1,000 ways it could be done depending on how one believes the mind works. Further, as in part we are technically talking about spirits here, which in lore have different cognitions to those born with physical forms, and jumping the gun for later in the video, this could be why Rook is able to escape easier than Solas. I have a lot of thoughts on this. We're going to be placing this in a nice box and throwing it in a corner while we continue. Anyway, despite there being 1,001 ways to get over regret, there are best practices and common things that will come up. So what are they? Using our previous talk on theories of regret, I want to discuss 3 different paths: the self-help, the common, and Katie's choice. I'm Katie, by the way. I don't know if that was established yet. The self-help. So what do I mean by self-help? Basically what I mean is that there is a huge business of others trying to tell people how to get over various woes, including regret, with varying degrees of helpfulness and authority on the subject. So what does the internet tell you to do if you're overwhelmed with regrets? BetterHelp suggests that you reflect and move on, make amends if possible, and forgive yourself. The last two are easy enough to understand, but BetterHelp explains the concept of moving on as such. One way to move forward from regret is to evaluate what happened and determine what you can take away from the situation and hard times that put you there. You might try to forget your inner critic for a moment and focus on what new things you've learned from your mistakes and how you're growing because of them. You can practice mindfulness to acknowledge your past, move forward, and begin to live life in the moment. And then they go into a few questions you can ask yourself to try and turn your regrets into actions and learning experiences. Another psych website that popped up a lot in my Google searches was Very Well Mind, and they described getting over regret as having empathy for yourself, cultivate self-compassion, forgiving yourself, and then journaling and seeing a therapist, which, not horrible advice, but besides the last two, those are largely the same thing. We're getting desperate, so how about WikiHow? Well, there is a long list of suggestions, but I would largely categorize them into self-forgiveness, making amends, and try to forget about it. And here is where I want to step in with my own experiences and the self-help movement. I'm cutting down a much longer rant that I have built up within me for the past decade or so, but in general, I find that there are two types of people. People who love self-help advice and people who find it cringe and stupid. In my opinion, the people who find it silly are the ones asking how just saying to yourself, I forgive myself, and let it go, will actually work. Those big, awful problems that I regret will just go away with a canned phrase. And then they get told by the self-help people that it will and it worked for them. And then the cynical ones try it with varying degrees of actually trying and find that it doesn't help. Now, there is a larger discussion here on how a lot of psychology is placebo, but I think the real difference is this. I find that people who enjoy self-help are the ones that already naturally had the problem worked out, but needed that push, who needed permission to go through with whatever was in their head, or who even had the emotion but didn't know how to express it and put it into words. So hearing the words that explains their emotions and thoughts helps things click into place. The cynical ones, though, the people that think self-help is bunk, those are the ones that are really lost within their problems. They need more help than what nice words will get them, and that's when a good therapist is needed. So in short, what does the common knowledge say to do to move on from regret? Well, they say to move on, to let go, to think past. And you either get it or you don't, which is both true and also inadequate. It's like if I summarize the Solas romance as a god who's trying to destroy the world, falls in love with a pretty girl, and then breaks up with her. You are losing all the emotion and thought behind it, but what you say is technically true. But I also think we shouldn't minimize simple words to help pass on emotional knowledge. While I love to dunk on the self-help industry all the time, in the right hands it can be a beautiful tool. Catherine Schultz, an author and journalist, did a wonderful TED Talk on regret ages ago. While she isn't a trained psychologist, I think her words cut a lot deeper than a lot of the self-help found online. And in my last dig on self-help, I think she's a wonderful example on why I think excellent artists will always do a better job than self-help psychologists. The common. I want you all to understand that the most widely passed around therapy techniques revolve around cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. There is a larger discussion here about some insurance companies paying for certain theories over others, and that CBT does really well in research studies, but for now, all you really need to know is that this is the most common therapy theory for a reason. CBT in general believes that problems arise because people are stuck in faulty thinking and learned patterns of negative behavior. So the solution to any psychological problems are teaching people ways to either break the pattern or change their way of thinking. Now, I also want to note that this is simplification, and there are a ton of other factors when you bring in diagnosable conditions like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, but that has nothing to do with this video, so we're moving on. Earlier in this video, we talked about Leahy's work on regret, and while he has a self-help book I mentioned earlier called If Only, I also found a lecture he did earlier this year on CBT for regret specifically. I've linked it down below for those who want to watch, but keep in mind that this was for a continuing education lecture, meaning that this is aimed at therapists looking to keep up with their licenses. The discussion of treatment starts around the 36-minute mark, where he discusses 8 styles of thinking that lead to excessive regret, and talks about these thinking patterns in depth, along with some therapy skills that he has done in his own practice. It's very much aimed at therapists, so this might be hard to follow for those not in the field or familiar with therapy, but the basics of CBT treatment for regret would be to find which of these thinking patterns is the problem for the client, and then trying to change and adapt those patterns. So, in short, in cognitive behavioral therapy, moving on from regret would mean to find and workshop on a thinking pattern that you have that has gone awry, preventing regret, a functional, purpose-driven emotion, from doing its job to help you learn, instead of creating loops of self-hatred and self-criticism. Katie's choice. So, you might have seen this coming because I'm following a pattern here, but what is it that I want to add in our discussion of the prison of regrets? Well, it's David I's and Gilovich's work on regret and self-discrepancy theory. Now, again, in full disclosure, I have a light understanding on how self-discrepancy theory works, so I apologize if I'm getting this incorrect. This is considered an odd theory in at least the circles I hung around, and would typically be used alongside a more traditional therapy theory in a clinical setting, if at all. From what I can find, studies are mixed on the validity of this theory, but I think it's a great theory for our fantasy uses, and we can just have fun with it, and fuck it. So in general, this theory states that any negative feelings are from major discrepancy in the cells, either by yourself or others. What was different about the paper was that where and what type of regrets fit into this model. So in this model, to let go of regret would be to try and fix the discrepancies of the self, which obviously is way easier said than done. What this looks like differs depending on the case, but some examples of this would include stopping certain behaviors, setting realistic goals for your ideals, reframing discrepancies into a positive, or in the case of self-discrepancy coming from the view from a person other than the self, like a family member or even one's culture, teaching a person self-compassion or working with one's family to edit their goals for the affected. From this more balanced view of the self, the regrets can be grappled and handled with care. Similar to the other theories, you can still regret those actions that were missed or taken, but with a clearer view of the self, they don't weigh as heavy and they don't cause you shame. Applying theory. Okay, finally jumping back to Dragon Age, let's take what we have learned and plop it onto their prison of regrets. So during the course of the game, we see the prison interact with a number of people, and it was made to hold 2 very specific people. So with our new lens, let's take a look at what could have or did happen. Rook. So despite having the most information on Rook and their successful journey through the prison, I do think that there's an element of them being the player character that's hard to talk about. Rook's mental journey depends on you and what you see, and I don't want to squash that bit of role-playing. So please keep in mind that a lot of this is super open to interpretation, and please fill in details that fit your Rook the best. So let's start from the beginning. Using Ghilanaine's death to weaken the prison walls enough to drag Rook in, they fall past a few of the big moments in game. The dragon that attacked the city, a statue from Weishaupt, and even falling on Ghilanaine's face before Solas gives his bitchy little speech that tips them over the edge. Once in the prison, Rook is met with a locked chest and wolf statues. We're going to skip that for now, but I'll talk about it in a moment. After that, they hear Varric calling for them upward, where they are met with their first trial, the Lost Ward Breaker. Either Nev or Balara chastise Rook, accusing them for their choices and expressing sorrow over trusting Rook to protect them. Rook chooses how to answer exactly, but either line basically boils down to them challenging the premise of the regret, that the Breaker knew what the cost was and accepted that. Rook made a choice and it ended poorly, but that ending isn't a weight they have to carry because they didn't know the outcome, and the real Breaker knew the risks. The first section is about Rook accepting that they can make choices that turn out poorly, and that doesn't make them unfit to lead or a bad person. Varric then has a line about Rook choosing the hard truth over the easy lie, unlike Solas. Now, I've seen a lot of discussion over this, mostly rejecting the idea that Solas can't accept hard truths. Now, I do want to circle around this, so we're going to pin it and get back to it later. Next is the Lost Leader. Either Harding or Davin will confront Rook, but different from the Lost Breaker, their understanding of Rook's choice. They appreciate Rook for the help they have given them, for the sacrifices that they took, and express that they wanted to give their all as well. So they did. Rook talks about honoring their sacrifice, and that they will continue the mission that they were set out to do. This second section is about Rook letting go of the guilt they carry when things go wrong. They honor the dead best by carrying on rather than focusing on how they failed them. Solas, on the other hand, saw everyone like a pawn to be used. Another pin here, we'll get back to it later. Finally, you are confronted by the truth of what happened to Varric. Rook is shaken by the truth, but Varric comforts them. He made the choice to talk to Solas, and Rook has no blame on what happened to him. Rook did the best they could given the circumstances. This third section is about Rook forgiving themselves for their failure to protect Varric. They acknowledge that they did the best they could, but it still wasn't enough. Now, I will say that there is an argument that this Varric is still a byproduct of Solas' blood magic. He appears different from the other regrets and is able to hold a conversation with Rook. It could even be the regret prison is using the blood magic curse to its advantage, using Varric's memory to talk to Rook as Varric proper, compared to Rook's warped view of the leader or the breaker through the lens of their regrets. Given that Varric was killed with the lyrium dagger, it could be possible that there was a piece of Varric that lingered in the lyrium and attached itself to Rook. He does call himself a memory, which lyrium is known to absorb. This spirals out into its own video topic one day, but yeah, it's possible Rook is talking to a version of Varric himself. Rook might also have lyrium poisoning if we want to get spicy with this theory, but that's for another day. With all that boiled down to its basic structure, let's apply some of our theories, because at its core, the regret prison is just a fucked up therapy session. Which I actually love this because therapy can be quite hard emotionally. So therapy as a form of torture for gods is like super amusing. I just love it so much. Anyway, we'll be focusing on CBT and self-discrepancy theories because the easy-to-find self-help take on regret is basically therapy theories without background and understanding. It's a purely emotional way to work on feelings, and in a way, that's exactly what the game gives you and is expected and correct in mainstream media. Games are art, and good art communicates through emotion, is trying to show, not tell. Cognitive behavioral theory. Let's start off with Leahy's styles of thinking that lead to regrets. I think there are arguments for like a lot of these in the regret prison, but personally I think the big hook to it all is the last one, the hindsight bias. To put it simply, hindsight bias is holding yourself up to the standard of knowledge that you have now rather than when an event happened. Rook should have known that the leader of the strike team would take charge and die. Rook should have known that Solas would stab Theric. Rook should have known, but they didn't. They couldn't. They can't control others' choices that lead to their deaths. Rook is human. They make mistakes. They have to lead without knowing everything, as all leaders must do. The journey through the regret prison is, in its own aggressive way, showing Rook the fallacy of their thinking through an altered version of an empty chair technique. What is that? Well, the empty chair technique is technically made for Gestalt theory, but this has been cannibalized by all sorts of theories and is actually very common in CBT as well. I linked a very short video down below that gives a good example on how it would be used in a real-world therapeutic setting if you want like finer details, but the short of it is this. You face an empty chair and imagine a person you want to talk to, and then you do. You tell the chair what you wanted to say, what you wanted to apologize for, what you wanted to say before they died. All except for Theric, you give Rook a prompt for conversation, like a therapist would, and Rook is able to fill in their thoughts and work through what happened on their own. Through this aggressive, magical version of an empty chair technique, Rook takes the time to verbalize and process all that has happened and can see the fallacy of their hindsight bias, freeing them from the prison. So, through this lens, how did Rook let go of their regret? They took the time to process and verbalize their feelings on their failure as a leader, realizing that they are holding themselves to an impossible expectation of a perfect outcome when they allow others to make their own choices, and forgive themselves for having limited knowledge of events. Self-discrepancy theory. So again, it's hard to analyze Rook because you as a player pump in a lot of personality and ideas onto the character, and I don't want to influence you. But this is at least how I see my Rook, Rowena, through this theory, and you can play with yours as you see fit. You should remember that in this theory, there are 3 views of the self. The actual Rook is just your player character, as they are. Rowena is a stern and competent enough Worm Watcher. She cares for others, perhaps too much at times, and sees herself as someone who took up leadership because no one else would. The ideal Rook is what your character wishes they would be. Rowena wants to use her leadership to save everyone. Each life is precious and should be respected and cared for, and she wants to live by those values. And the Ought Rook is what your character should be. Rowena is the only one able to get information and guidance from Solas. She alone has the knowledge and means to kill the remaining Evanuris that she freed by accident. She must be the leader of the Veilguard to save the world. In this theory, I believe each of the sections of the regret prison appeal to each of the selves. The Lost Breaker to the Ought self, because they chastise Rook for not living up to their duty as the leader to protect people. The Lost Leader to the Ideal selves, as Rook's example and leadership inspired their actions of self-sacrifice. And Varric to the actual self, as he talks to Rook about who they are now, that they did well enough and they have what they need at this moment to stop Solas. Rook's journey through the prison and responses to the Lost Companions are helping to level out their views of themselves and leadership, and they find that despite all the problems and setbacks they have encountered on their journey, that doesn't reflect on them poorly as a leader. So through this lens, how did Rook let go of their regrets? By confronting the ghosts of those their leadership has wronged, they are able to verbalize and process their failures while recognizing that they did the best they could given everything that has happened, and that even leaders cannot control every aspect of a situation. This then helps even out the views of their different selves. The Evanuris. Ghilanade and Elgranon do not regret. This is, again, something that Solas writes about in the Wolf Den Codex. But he built a cage locked with regret anyway. Couldn't they just walk out because they don't give a fuck? Well, no, as stated earlier, what causes the rift to open in the first place is feeling those regrets. But even if they were to start processing those regrets and open the rift, the prison would then be able to drag them down and start to taunt them until they were able to really grapple with their feelings. While we did get insight into who Elgranon and Ghilanade were, as people, I'm not sure we really have enough to do a deep psychological dive. That said, I do want to point out one codex entry. In Note to Elgranon, found during the Isle of Gods quest, you see a letter to Elgranon from Ghil. You have also kindly suggested I spend time to mourn, but Andrul is lost, gone. It is a tribute to her skill that our people's descendants remember her as she was, a warrior of supreme skill, lethal, swift, unsurpassed. I look forward to building a monument to her in our new empire. Also, using another codex from Solas to Ghil, talking about her rise to godhood, we know that her and Andrul were lovers for ages. Obviously, we don't know how their relationship worked, but I feel like this is such a callous way to talk about a dead loved one. Now, it's clear in the language Ghil cares for Andrul deeply, but I mean callous to herself and her own emotions. She doesn't want to show weakness in the face of her loss, even though Elgranon can seem to sense or at least predict it. And I think this is a good example of their mental state. These are beings who are older than almost everything we know, who wake up from imprisonment to see everything they have built, everyone who they have loved is gone, yet they don't mourn. They compartmentalize and start anew on controlling Thetis. They have put aside all they have with the justification that once they have enough power, then it will be time to build that monument, to mourn and process. But the trick is, they will never have enough power. There will always be more to find, more to want. Solas's prison is an acknowledgement of that, putting them in their lowest, knowing that they will never process, but at the same time there is a glimmer of hope that perhaps they can change for the better, even if Solas himself has no faith in that idea. Besides all this, is there any literature on people who don't feel regrets? Keeping this section short, but Leahy briefly mentions this in his webinar. Basically, he describes people with a deficit of regret as those who tend to be impulsive and think they can handle more than they can, because they have not learned from their past behaviors. His examples are largely about substance abuse, but I think that Evanuris' use of the blight and the addicting power it brings fits in well with his view of regret. If we take the self-discrepancy theory on regret here, it would be a very simple model. They see themselves as gods. Their actual self is perfectly aligned with their ideal and their odd selves. How could they regret when they are perfection? The only time there seems to be a break in this balance is when Ghilanane is dying. She laments to Elgranon that they had so many plans for this world. In this moment is her regret, because in this moment, the vision of herself as a god does not match with her reality, a dying mortal. Solas. First, if you remembered, I pinned 2 comments from Rook's time in the prison about Solas, so here I want to address those first, and then we'll get to there's just a lot I have to say on Solas, guys. I'm so sorry. Hard truths over the easy lie. So in this argument, Solas grapples with a lot of his hard truths in Trespasser. He has accepted his guilt over his role in the fall of Arlathan and the Elvan people. He accepts that his veil and imprisonment of the Evanuris is what did all of that. Where is the easy lie?
You love the Fade. Why would you create the veil to hide it all away?
Because every alternative was worse.
It's right there. There is no way to know for certain that the veil was the best option. It certainly could have been the best option that he had come up with at that time, but to say that everything was worse is a comforting lie, something that I think is also reflected in the short story callback from Tevinter Nights. When the regret demon that was born of Solas' regret dies, there is a glimpse of what it could have been. For a moment, the sunlight illuminated something within, a sliver of the spirit that might have been. Not the opposite of regret, a different flavor or shade, contemplation, introspection. It felt the echo of the actions that had summoned it. There might have been a better choice, to the thought it had not been allowed. The comforting lie that Solas has been telling himself is what Varric tells Rook at the end of the prison. Solas can't grapple with the hard truth that he isn't as wise as he should be. He lost that part of himself when he gained a body. He can't accept that he would make choices that aren't the best. And when I say that, I don't mean he blindly refuses to acknowledge that he fucked up or makes stupid choices, because he clearly does that at the end of Inquisition when talking to Flemeth and has dialogue calling his younger self foolish. What I mean is that he can't forgive himself for it. He can't forgive himself for failing and making poor choices, and he's burdened with that shame. The comforting lie that he tells himself is that he's just the villain, so of course he made bad decision that gets people killed. Of course his choices hurt others and those around him. Solas is a bad person, and so he makes the decisions that get good people killed. People as pawns. If you were taking in all of Dragon Age media in chronological order, the very first time you meet Solas would be when he stabs Felisan in the back at the end of Masked Empire. Now, this wouldn't be confirmed until Trespasser, but it's him all the same, as shown in Veilguard, where it's one of the regretful remnants that you fight in the Crossroads. The argument I see is that Solas obviously cares for people as people. He approves of helping the common folk in Inquisition and generally cares for others in his dialogue and banter. My argument is that those two ideas are not mutually exclusive. Solas can care and appreciate people and loved ones, and then turn around and use them when it furthers his goals. I would argue for a majority of the people we see Solas betray, he tries to soften the blow to make it as kind of a betrayal as possible. With the Inquisitor, even one that he hates, he is polite and saves their life, all the while letting them deal with the Canari that are in his crossword network. With the spirits he kills off in one of his memories, he tells Veilguard that they died true to their nature, something I would argue he wishes he could do. Even with Rook, whom he knows he lumped with a heavy burden of responsibility, he relieves them of their duties before they fall into the prison, something that emotionally breaks him when Mythal does the same action in the Redeem ending. This all loops into that easy lie he tells himself. He needs to fix his mistakes to become that hero again, so why not let a few go by his caring hand to save the rest? Alright, moving on, let's talk about that chest in the Regret Prison. To unlock it, you need to find 3 wolf statues and gather the mementos. Inside the chest are a few runes and some elven armor, and whatever. My theory is that the 3 mementos were to be Solas' trials that he did not complete, so let's talk about that. The 3 mementos are as such. The Remnant of Failure, which uses the broken orb model from Dragon Age Inquisition. Orb shards broken by misplaced trust, slivers of an irretrievable power, the kindling of regrets, humming with a diffuse lost vitality. The Remnant of Reflection, which uses the model of Solas' paint palette. We know it's a Solas' paint palette because you can find it in the Lighthouse, it's also in the art book, but it's not really to talk about in game. Whatever. Ages of paint, stone dry and volcanically uneven, capture eerie splashes of strange azures, unsettling scarlets and choleric ambers, colors to match the eye of an elven god. And finally, the Remnant of Parting, which uses a tiny golden version of the Dragon Mythal statue. Mythal and Dragon aspect offers different wisdoms and protections, striding with the powers of hidden ways. Fingerprints mar the golden shine as if well handled. Before I launch into this next book, I do want to address one thing I have heard, the question of, why did Solas, creator of the trap and known emotionally intelligent overthinker, not attempt the trials and free himself? And I think the last memento is the answer. I think he did, perhaps multiple times, but got stuck here. Mythal and what she represents is just too much. It would take too long. And he knew this. Switching with Rook was the quickest solution to get out and save the world from the freed Evanuris. I think there's also an element of similarity between the Evanuris and Solas in this aspect that I think has led to his own moral corruption. While the Evanuris seem to bottle their regrets and therefore do not learn from their mistakes, behind the wall of, when I have enough power I'll deal with this, Solas actually has the same problem, but instead of power, I believe he tells himself, when my work is done. A subtle but similar enough emotional trap, because now he believes he's the only person who can right his wrongs. He's the only one with the right knowledge, an unwilling god. And I also think he knows this. He knows he's being corrupted by taking on all the trouble of the world and not taking care of his own emotional state. But the last time he let someone else try to do a job he should have done, Mythal was murdered. And after all, he only needs to do just one more thing, just take down the veil, and it's all over, and then he can atone. If you remember when I was talking about Rook, I broke down their trials as largely about their regrets on their choices, their guilt, and their failure. Looking at the mementos, they break down into the medium in which Solas expresses his poor choices, a reminder of Solas' failure to Mythal, and a remnant of Solas' guilt on his inability to fix his mistakes. Hey wait, isn't the one you labeled as representing his guilt literally called Remnant of Failure? Okay, yeah. But I do think there is a disconnect to the word in the memento and what it represents. Solas says in the Redeem ending that he failed Mythal and talks about his guilt and the people he has wronged, aka the Inquisitor. I think in this case there is just a misalignment in the naming of the mementos, and I don't want to call it a glitch, but I am just saying that the orb being called Remnant of Parting makes a lot more sense than the Mythal statue, given the last time that we saw it was the last time the Inquisitor saw Solas before he left. This is me coping. Fine, whatever. Fine. Side note, I think you could also make an argument that this same trio of emotional trials makes its appearances again during the Redeem ending. Rook is there reflecting to Solas on his mistakes and regrets, like his murals that he painted in the lighthouse. The Inquisitor is there representing the people he has wronged, like the orb, the central artifact in Inquisition, and Morgan as the host of Mythal's memories is there to challenge his view on his failure to her. So then, how would Solas move on from his regrets? So we do get a small piece of this puzzle in game during the Redeem ending. It has to do with Mythal. While the Inquisitor's forgiveness and Rook/Varric's appeal is no small part, Mythal does something that the Inquisitor and Varric simply could not. The reality is that Mythal's relationship with Solas is kept intentionally vague. Is she his lover, his friend, his queen, his mother, his owner? The true answer is up to you and play around with in your version of Thetis. But you're already deep into me talking about my own theory, so it's my take. My view on the relationship is that they were all of it. They have known each other for eons. Their relationship has been warped and changed in various ways throughout time, and the only constant of the relationship was defined in the Music Room Codex. They understood each other, and I would say both were scared to let that go. Doing my best to not give another giant therapy lecture, but when you give me two people in a horrible relationship, I just love it. This is my curse. This is my burden. I mentioned earlier that family therapy has different theories than individual, so the one I worked with the most was called structural. The very shortened version of this theory is that each family or couple unit has a structure to how they work. There is a dynamic there that you can map out, analyze, and point out flaws to make the unit work properly. It's a little bit like CBT, but for a group, kind of. Trying to shorten a big rant, but I would consider Mythal and Solas to have, at one point, been enmeshed with one another. What does that mean? Enmeshment is basically the term for when two people, or even a whole family unit, do not have proper personal boundaries. This can look like different things depending on what type of relationship we're talking about, but with Mythal and Solas, the problem is that we don't know what the relationship is. And I don't mean because we weren't given enough details, but I honestly think, in lore, these two gained bodies and had no idea how to be people. They didn't know what they wanted to be to each other or themselves, so they tried to be everything. They cared deeply for one another, but were young and had no idea how relationships work when you have more depths of emotion. She tried to mother and rule him at the same time he tried to guide and protect her. They meant everything to each other, and I mean everything, and it hurt them deeply when they disappointed one another. Because I'm trying to avoid another giant lecture on enmeshment, I've linked a few videos about it below, and I would recommend watching them if you want to get a better idea on how I at least see the Mythal-Solas dynamic, but whatever. So what does Mythal do that Varric, Felisan, and the Inquisitor just couldn't? She set a boundary in their relationship. In her speech to him, she, 1, acknowledges that she used him and that it hurt him. 2, takes responsibility by shouldering her part of the blame that he has taken on completely. And 3, lets go of all connections and expectations of him. Whatever they were before, they are now strictly just old friends, a relationship title that does not carry emotional expectations. He is no longer her weapon, and he can choose to be who he wants to be. While he heard that term various times from Mythal's fragment, he never heard it from her whole, and that's who he needed to hear it from. And here's why I want to loop in the self-discrepancy theory, because I love this theory with spirits, and I think Solas and the rest of the original Elven still have this mindset. I've been using Solas as the example this whole time because this is really what I've been wanting to talk about since I started this video. Solas's ought self is what Mythal made him to be. This is Solas as the fixer, Solas as the catalyst to change. This is the Solas Mythal asked for and put into her service, the man who, time and again, she asked to resolve an impossible problem, and he did so, but bent to her wills even when he did not think it was wise. Her will was his duty. When Mythal frees him of her service, that slot is now replaced by what he wants it to be. The hero that Varric describes him being deep down, the man Cole references in one of his Trespasser dialogues.
Barefaced but free, frolicking, fighting fierce. He wants to give wisdom, not orders.
So what about CBT? In Leahy's list of mental loops that trap you in regret, I think there are a few that you can apply to Solas, so then it would just be a matter of him working out one of those mental loops, but even in this theory, I think a lot of them revolve around Mythal's emotional hold on Solas. This is where I go off the cuff a bit, because while Leahy doesn't bring up what I'm about to talk about in his webinar, it does come up in his book and a few interviews he did. What Solas is constantly saying when talking about taking down the veil can be summarized up with, I don't want to do this, but I have to. We have theorized on why he feels like he has to for ages, but Veilguard gives us an answer. He feels like he has to because he sacrificed everything he was for Mythal in her vision of the Elven Empire. To stop chasing that goal would be to let all his sins be for naught. Basically, Solas is caught up in the sunk cost fallacy. If you are unfamiliar with sunk cost, in short, it's an economics principle that has been taken on in various psychological ones as well. In the world of cognitive psych, the sunk cost fallacy is when you keep pouring your time and energy on something because you have already put way too much into it. Solas has put too much of himself in her goals for the Elven Empire. So when the Mythal fragment chastises him for continuing a vision that she no longer believes in, of course he claims that she's not really Mythal. He knows she's only part of herself. The other part he locked away, perhaps scared to visit her because she too might have the same opinion. So when those two parts are brought together and tells him that he is no longer bound by her wills, she is stopping that fallacy. She breaks off that sunk cost, ending it for him, and thus he is able to act on his own wants and desires that he has not allowed himself to for who knows how long. Now, why couldn't Felisan, the Inquisitor, Varric, or Rook break that for him? Because they all certainly tried in their own way. Well, again, this has to do with his relationship with Mythal and how wrapped up she is in his life. Mythal was the only one to be there at almost every step, to make the same mistakes he did, and to show him that she set down that goal as well. She did, so he should. Only she could tell him that. Now, before I go into the next section, I do want to lightly touch on the idea of Mythal being abusive to Solas, as she's the one egging him on in almost all of the regret murals. Now, as is pointed out in game, the murals are made from Solas' memories, so it paints a one-sided picture of their relationship. Here is where I'm holding back a larger conversation about how unreliable memories are, because honestly, it doesn't really matter what the truth is. This is how Solas sees the relationship. He's sorrowful over a deep relationship, one he cared so much for and sacrificed everything for, but would constantly ask too much and not support him in return. Was she abusive? I'm going to be the controversial one and say I don't know if we have those details. Psychological abuse in a clinical setting is defined as patterns of behavior, and a small handful of conversations from a relationship that lasted thousands of years is really not that much. Granted, we are talking about a fantasy relationship. Real relationships, completely different. If you have this many conversations with a loved one, it sounds like this. That's bad. Don't be with someone like this. But I do think we can say without a doubt that they hurt each other deeply. I see the relationship as a very real and raw exploration of where things aren't black and white. Yes, it was Mythal that urged him to take a body he hated, but he never told her no to sundering the Titans, even though he knew it was a bad idea. Yes, it was Mythal that took on the mantle of a god, but Solas was willing to sacrifice millions in taking down the Veil and was upset that she didn't accept that. I've seen fans on various social media platforms argue over who was right, but the point is neither of them were. Sometimes people who were good as individuals pair up and corrupt each other. In the end, your interpretation of the relationship is the correct one, but I see it as a tragedy of a bad relationship, and that sometimes love is not enough, and in this case, love can deeply wound. Lavellen. Hey, we're talking about the regret prison here. Why am I waffling on about the romance? Well, because I'm a dirty Lavellen. You better fucking accept it. But if you did not play Veilguard with the Solas romance, then you might not know that during his redeem ending, Lavellen can go with Solas to be with her love for all eternity. I'm not here to deep dive into the ending slides yet, but take a look at these. In the ending slides for the Violent, Trick, and both redeem endings, there are subtle differences between them that I think speak volumes to Solas' mental state at the end of the game. In the Violent ending, where he is dragged to his prison yelling that he is a god, which is in character. We're not talking about this now, but that is in character, and I will actually fight you. I'm just saying. Anyway, Solas is dressed in full armor, falling into the dark depths of the Regret prison, likely to live out his days like the Evanuris were to live. In the Trick ending, where he is dragged into the prison stating that he is a fool and he was outmatched, he falls into the Golden Abyss, dressed in armor, but one more plain. I think in this interpretation of the slides, he will one day be able to grapple with his regrets. In the non-romance redeem ending, you see him walk into the Golden Prison, dressed in robes similar to that in his various tarot cards. He will find his atonement faster, already able to start his journey the moment he enters. And finally, in the romance ending, he is still to embrace Lavellen dressed in clothes that are reminiscent of his casual wear in Inquisition. Lavellen is a unique aspect in the prison because for all we know, the prison is not designed to handle more than one person. Her presence is an unknown, and from the little tidbits we have from dev posts, it's one that can dismantle some of the more grueling aspects of the prison. Lavellen tells Solas, and I think truly believes, that his prison won't be terrible if she's with him. In the Fade, that sincere belief is everything, and I honestly believe her love would fundamentally change the magic of the prison. She has been chasing down Solas for a decade, trying to convince him to stop, and she just did. She won. She's reunited with her true love, and while I'm sure she has regrets, they are far from her mind, and in this moment, they are glowing. But what about the more practical aspects of the prison? Is Dirthalen immortal now that she's in the Fade? Can you eat? Can you sleep? Weeks has basically said that it's up to us as players to decide what story we like better. Dirthalen can live happily forever after, or if you like the drama of her only living a few short years before dying, then that's the story you can have. I do think, personally, Dirthalen would be immortal in the prison. I'm certain Solas could work something out, and if nothing else, being in the Fade could trigger whatever makes elves immortal. Now, another question to ask is how the time works. Keep in mind that Rook was there for an hour or so to them, but their companions note that it was days, even weeks of them missing. A year to our happy couple could be an age to Thetis. I also think that there are some small leaks to the outside world as well, given that Solas is able to make sense of rumblings in the Fade about Rook's adventures, so there might be a way to listen in to the outside world. Solas talks about calming the Blight during both Redeem endings. I've seen popular headcanons about the two walking the Black City together, trying to make it golden again. On one hand, I don't think they would be able to do that from the prison unless Dirthalen was able to change the boundaries that much. It would just be a bad idea to have such access to the Evanuris, given that that's where the rest of the Blight is, and they could probably do a lot with that. On the other hand, if we take the ending slides at face value, all versions of Solas are now located in the same bubble as the Black City, so if they could travel there, then yes, maybe they do physically clean up the Black City. Personally, I take the idea that Solas can somehow interact with the dreams of the Titans from the Regret prison via his dreams and not like physically, and that perhaps slowly turns the city golden again. Ghil and Elgar do talk briefly about dreaming in their prison and talk about a discordant refrain. This video is long enough, so I won't bore you with all the references, but the Blight is said to have a song in its call. So I believe that even in the original design of the prison, the Evanuris were doomed to hear the sad calling of their Blight forever. So I imagine Solas set up something similar for the Regret prison. I don't think we will ever get a solid answer on what the Redeem prison is like, partly because I've already seen people having a lot of fun playing around with that idea, and I doubt the devs want to solidify anything that avoids that. But one thing I want to say is this. Solas does not need Dirthalen to heal from his regrets. This is a journey he must and can do on his own, a harsh but true lesson in life. Love cannot heal all wounds. But only in the romance ending does Solas gain what he has fought for his entire life, to be understood by another and for her to choose him in return. He is not dressed for battle or for travel, he is dressed for comfort, for home. And that, dear patrons, is all that I have on the Regret prison. And probably a lot more than that. We sort of kind of rolled around a bunch of topics a bit here and there, but I just love this so much and just vomited out a whole bunch of stuff I wanted to talk about. But thank you for being so patient. I worked really hard on this because I just really like this topic. It's very nostalgic for me in a way because I found Dragon Age when I was in my master's program. So like getting to apply these theories to a new Dragon Age game was really fun. But yeah, this was my pet project, and I don't know if I'll do another one of these again, but you know, whatever. But what do you all think? Do you still have lingering questions, proof that I'm wrong, comments about your own fan theory? Feel free to tweet me at Gildathon on Twitter or Blue Sky. To rest your all.